A young man pauses mid-step as he notices a stranger sitting alone, tears streaming down their face. What he does next? It's something no one in the room could have expected, and it leaves everyone speechless. It was a chilly autumn afternoon, and the small cafe on the corner was bustling with life. The scent of freshly brewed coffee wafted through the air, mingling with the faint sweetness of pastries resting behind a glass counter. The soft hum of conversation created a cozy backdrop, punctuated by the occasional clatter of cups and the hiss of the espresso machine. Barron Trump sat at a quiet table near the large window, the golden sunlight streaming through and casting long shadows on the hardwood floor. Dressed in a simple sweater and jeans, he seemed to blend in with the crowd, a young man lost in thought, his hands cradling a warm cup of tea. Outside, leaves danced in the wind, painting the streets in hues of amber and crimson. Across the room, a stranger sat hunched over a small table, their shoulders trembling. It wasn't immediately obvious to anyone else, but Barron noticed the slight shake of their hands as they tried to steady a steaming cup of coffee. Their face was partially hidden, but it was clear they were crying, silent tears slipping down their cheeks and pooling on the table. The stranger was a man in his early 40s, wearing a faded jacket that had seen better days. His hair was slightly disheveled, and his expression carried the weight of someone who had been fighting an unseen battle for far too long. Despite the warmth of the cafe, there was an undeniable chill around him, as if the world had left him out in the cold for too long. Barron's gaze lingered, his brow furrowing with concern. Most of the patrons around him were incredibly concerned about the press. Some of them read the news with fright. Laura Hatlin, accomplice, having lost her 8-year-old son at a massive school tournament, and Karen Harrell, her son taken from her in the casket when the bodyguard murdered Brian. But Barron couldn't look away. Something about the man's quiet sorrow tugged at his heart, compelling him to act. He glanced down at his tea, his mind racing. What could he do? Would approaching a stranger in pain be the right thing to do, or would it only make things worse? As he wrestled with his thoughts, the man across the room let out a quiet, shaky breath, his hand moving to wipe away a tear. Barron made his decision. Setting down his cup, he stood up slowly, his chair scraping softly against the floor. He had no idea what he was going to say or do, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't just sit there and do nothing. Barron approached the table cautiously, his steps measured and deliberate. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The man didn't notice him at first, too lost in whatever thoughts had brought him to tears. Barron hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to begin. The last thing he wanted was to make the man feel self-conscious or intruded upon. But something in his gut told him to speak up. "Excuse me," Barron said softly, his voice steady but kind. The man looked up, startled, his red-rimmed eyes meeting Barron's. For a moment there was a flicker of defensiveness, as if he were bracing for judgment or criticism. But Barron's calm demeanor seemed to ease him slightly. "I couldn't help but notice. You seem upset," Barron continued. "Is there anything I can do to help?" The man stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether or not to respond. Finally, he sighed deeply, his shoulders sagging under the invisible weight he carried. "It's nothing," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Just a bad day, I guess." Barron pulled out the chair across from him and sat down, maintaining a respectful distance. "Sometimes talking about it helps," he offered gently. "I don't mean to intrude, but if you want to share, I'm here to listen." The man hesitated again, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup. It was clear he wasn't used to people reaching out to him like this. After what felt like an eternity, he began to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. "My name's James," he said, "and, yeah, I've been having more than just a bad day." He paused, swallowing hard. "I lost my job a few months ago. Worked at the same place for years, and then one day it was just gone. They downsized, said it wasn't personal, but it feels personal when it's your livelihood, you know?" Barron nodded, his expression one of genuine understanding. "That sounds incredibly tough," he said. James continued, his words spilling out now that the dam had broken. "I've been trying to make ends meet, doing odd jobs here and there, but it's like, no matter how hard I try, I can't catch a break. Life is just too much sometimes. I'm not free making it. My landlord's been patient, but rent's overdue, and I'm not sure how much longer I can hold things together. Today, I don't know. It all felt like too much. He paused, his hands trembling slightly as he took a sip of his coffee. And then I thought, maybe I should just come here, sit for a bit, try to clear my head, but it doesn't seem to be working. Barron's heart ached as he listened. He could see the pain etched into every line of James's face, the exhaustion that came from fighting an uphill battle for so long. He thought about the countless people who must pass James by every day, never stopping to ask if he was okay, never taking the time to notice his struggles. "I'm really sorry you're going through this," Barron said, his voice filled with empathy. "It sounds like you've been carrying a lot on your own." James nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Yeah," he said, his voice breaking. I just don't know how much longer I can keep going like this." Barron leaned forward slightly, his expression earnest. "You don't have to do it alone," he said. "Sometimes, even the smallest bit of help can make a difference." As the words hung in the air, James looked at Barron with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. It had been a long time since someone had truly seen him, let alone offered to help. For the first time in months, he felt a glimmer of hope, a tiny, fragile thing, but enough to make him wonder if maybe, just maybe, things could get better. Barron sat quietly for a moment, absorbing everything James had shared. The cafe seemed to hum around them, the sounds of coffee cups clinking and quiet chatter creating a strange contrast to the intensity of their conversation. Barron's mind was racing. What could he possibly do to help? He wasn't sure yet, but he knew he couldn't just walk away. "You've been through so much," Barron said gently, "and I don't have all the answers, but I want to help in whatever way I can." James gave a small, tired laugh, shaking his head. "I appreciate the sentiment, but there's not much anyone can do. Life's just hard sometimes." Barron leaned forward, his voice firm but kind. "Maybe, but that doesn't mean we should stop trying to make it better." His shoulders tensing. "I've been staying at a motel," he admitted, "but I'm running out of money for that too." Barron nodded, his mind already working through the logistics. "Okay," he said. "Let's start with this. I'll cover the cost of your motel for the next couple of weeks. That'll give you some breathing room to figure things out." James's eyes widened, and for a moment he was too stunned to speak. "You don't have to do that," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can't accept that." "You can," Barron said firmly. "And you will. It's not a handout. It's a chance for you to catch your breath." James shook his head, a mix of gratitude and disbelief washing over him. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Barron replied. "Just let me help." As Barron tapped on his phone, arranging for a payment to the motel, James sat back in his chair, his hands gripping the edge of the table. The weight that had been pressing down on him for months felt just a little lighter. But Barron wasn't done. "Tell me about the work you've been looking for," he said. "What's your experience?" "I worked in construction for years," James explained, "but I've been looking for anything. Warehouse jobs, maintenance, even landscaping. It's just hard to get a foot in the door when you're older and don't have a permanent address." Barron nodded thoughtfully. "That makes sense. What if I help you with that too? I know some people who might be able to connect you with opportunities." James's eyes filled with tears, and he quickly looked away, embarrassed by his emotions. You don't even know me," he said, his voice trembling. "Why are you doing this?" Barron paused, his gaze steady. "Because I've been given a lot in life," he said simply, "and I believe it's my responsibility to give back when I can. You don't have to be famous or rich to help someone. You just have to care." Their conversation stretched on, with Barron asking more about James's background and goals, the two men describing their day as full of triumph and humility and hope as they watched countless others find happiness in their greatest humanity. Around them, other cafe patrons began to notice the interaction. Some watched curiously, while others exchanged quiet smiles, moved by the kindness unfolding before them. One woman, sitting a few tables away, whispered to her friend, "I don't know who that young man is, but he's got a good heart." By the time Barron stood to leave, He had not only covered James's motel stay, but had also promised to connect him with a local nonprofit that provided job placement assistance. He left James with his phone number and a sense of hope that had been missing for far too long. As Barron walked out of the cafe, he couldn't help but feel a sense of purpose. He didn't know what would happen next, but he was determined to do everything in his power to make a difference. And for James, the world suddenly felt a little less lonely. A week passed, and James was back at the cafe, sipping on a hot coffee Barron had insisted on buying him through a prepaid tab. Though his circumstances hadn't magically resolved, there was a noticeable change in his demeanor. He sat a little taller, his shoulders less burdened. The smallest glimmers of hope had begun to shine through. As James flipped through a newspaper, the sound of the door opening drew his attention. Barron walked in, a familiar warm smile on his face. He wasn't alone. With him was a man in his late 50s, dressed in a crisp button-up shirt and carrying a folder. Barron waved as he approached James's table. "James, I'd like you to meet Mr. Carter," Barron said, gesturing to the man beside him. "He runs a local construction company and has been looking for experienced workers." James blinked, stunned by the introduction. "Nice to meet you," he said, extending his hand. Mr. Carter shook it firmly. "Barron told me about you," he said. "Said you've got years of experience and are looking to get back on your feet. I've got a crew that could use someone reliable. If you're willing to come in for an interview, we can see if it's a good fit." James felt his throat tighten, emotions welling up. He hadn't expected this. A real chance to regain stability. I don't know what to say," he stammered. "Thank you, both of you." "That's not all," Barron said, his voice steady but filled with quiet excitement. He placed a small envelope on the table. "I also reached out to a nonprofit that helps with housing. They've agreed to cover your next month's rent if you're ready to move out of the motel. It's not permanent, but it's a start." James stared at the envelope, his hands trembling. Tears brimmed in his eyes as he looked from Barron to Mr. Carter. "You've done so much for me already. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "You don't have to repay me," Barron said, "but you can pay it forward when you're in a position to help someone else." Just as James was processing everything, another unexpected moment unfolded. A woman from across the cafe approached their table. She had been quietly watching the interaction and seemed hesitant but determined. "I don't mean to interrupt," she began, her voice soft but steady. "But I overheard what's happening, and I just wanted to say, it's inspiring. Sometimes it feels like no one cares anymore, but seeing this reminds me that kindness still exists." She set a small envelope on the table. "This is for you," she said to James. "It's not much, just a gift card I wasn't using, but maybe it'll help." James was overwhelmed. He looked at the envelope, then at the woman, and finally back at Barron. "I don't understand," he said, his voice breaking. "Why would strangers do all of this for me?" Barron smiled, his eyes warm with sincerity. "Because sometimes we all need a reminder that we're not alone. And kindness, it has a way of spreading." The moment was electric. The cafe hushed as patrons tuned in to the exchange. What had started as a simple act of empathy had turned into a ripple effect of generosity and human connection. James wasn't just receiving help. He was witnessing a community come together, all because one person had cared enough to start a conversation. In that instant, James realized that his life was about to change. Not just because of the opportunities he'd been given, but because of the hope that had been reignited in his heart. For the first time in what felt like forever, he believed in a brighter future. The atmosphere in the cafe had shifted. What began as an ordinary day had turned into something extraordinary. The patrons who had been busy with their own lives were now witnesses to a moment of pure humanity. The air buzzed with an unspoken understanding, a shared realization that kindness could change everything. James sat at the table, the envelopes and business cards in front of him. His eyes were misty, and his voice trembled as he spoke. "I don't even know how to thank you," he said, looking at Barron. "I've felt invisible for so long, like no one cared whether I existed or not. And now this feels like a miracle." Barron reached across the table, his hand resting gently on James's. "You don't need to thank me," he said softly. "You're not invisible. You matter, and you're going to make it through this. I believe in you." Nearby, the woman who had offered the gift card wiped a tear from her cheek. She turned to her friend and whispered, "It's so easy to forget how much even a small gesture can mean to someone. Watching this makes me want to do more." A young barista standing behind the counter leaned in closer to her coworker. "Did you see what he just did for that man?" she asked, her voice filled with awe. "It makes me want to be better, to pay attention to people who might be struggling." Even the cafe manager, who had initially been skeptical of the commotion, found himself moved. "You don't see things like this every day," he murmured, folding his arms as he watched the scene unfold. "It's inspiring." James's gratitude spilled over as he looked at Mr. Carter, the construction manager who had offered him a job opportunity. "I'll work harder than anyone you've ever hired," James said earnestly. "You won't regret giving me this chance." Mr. Carter smiled, his expression kind. "I'm not worried about that," he said. "Everyone deserves a second chance. Just show up ready to put in the effort and we'll figure out the rest." As James absorbed the kindness surrounding him, a small group of other customers approached the table, each offering their own words of encouragement. "You've got this, man," one said, clapping James on the shoulder. "We're all rooting for you." "Take it one step at a time," another added. "You're stronger than you think." James felt a warmth he hadn't known in years, a sense of belonging, of being seen. The cafe, once just a place for coffee and passing strangers, had become a haven of compassion. For Barron, the moment was deeply personal. He hadn't set out to change the world, but seeing the impact of his actions, the way one simple gesture had created a ripple effect, filled him with a profound sense of purpose. He thought about the challenges James had faced and how easy it would have been for him to walk away without getting involved. But now, as he watched James surrounded by support, he knew he'd made the right choice. "I hope you know this isn't just about today," Barron said, his voice steady. "This is the start of something better. You're going to rebuild your life, and you'll inspire others along the way." James nodded, his determination growing stronger with every kind word and gesture. He stood up, gripping Barron's hand tightly. "You've given me more than I could have ever imagined," he said. "I'll never forget this." The cafe erupted in quiet applause, the sound gentle but heartfelt. It wasn't a loud or boisterous celebration. It was something deeper, a collective acknowledgement of what they had all just witnessed. For a moment, everyone felt connected by the power of kindness, their faith in humanity renewed. As Barron stepped out of the cafe, the weight of the moment stayed with him. It wasn't the kind of feeling you could easily explain. It was a quiet realization that small actions, even those that seemed insignificant at first, could change lives in ways you'd never expect. For James, a simple interaction had turned into a turning point. He had walked into the cafe carrying the burden of countless struggles, but he was walking out with something far greater than a job opportunity or financial assistance. He was walking out with hope. The kindness he experienced reminded him that no matter how difficult life gets, there are people willing to help, to listen, and to care. This story isn't just about James or Barron. It's about all of us. How often do we walk past someone who looks like they're struggling without giving it a second thought? How many chances do we miss to extend a hand or offer a kind word? We may think our actions are too small to matter, but in truth, they can spark a ripple effect that goes far beyond what we can see. The lesson here is simple yet profound. Kindness costs nothing, but its impact is immeasurable. When we choose to care, to connect, and to take action, we remind others and ourselves that we're not alone in this world. It doesn't take grand gestures or perfect circumstances to make a difference. Sometimes it's the smallest acts that leave the biggest marks. For Barron, the experience reaffirmed a belief his mother had instilled in him since childhood. If you have the power to help, you have the responsibility to act. Those words echoed in his mind as he thought about the chain reaction that had unfolded in the cafe. One act of kindness had inspired others, proving that compassion has a way of bringing people together. As you hear this story, think about what you can do in your own life. Maybe it's helping a neighbor, offering encouragement to a friend, or simply smiling at a stranger who looks like they're having a hard day. These small moments add up, creating a better, kinder world for all of us. Because in the end, what truly matters isn't what we have or achieve, it's the connections we make and the impact we leave behind. Kindness is a gift we can all give, and its effects can last a lifetime. If this story moved you, imagine how many others could use a reminder of the power of kindness. Let's spread this message together. Share this video with someone who could use a little inspiration today. And if you want more heartfelt stories that remind us of what truly matters, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Hit the like button, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and turn on notifications so you never miss a moment of inspiration. Together, we can make kindness go viral.